and thanks for chairing this so effectively. And I'm grateful for the invitation to say something. I'll try and say something about the way in which all of this has unfolded throughout our conversation, and then try and pick up on a couple of questions I've noted in the chat as well. So as I say, I have to plead guilty to having something to do with this. I was the Secretary of State for DCMS at the time at which the white paper was produced. And things have changed a bit since then, but I'd be lying if I didn't say I'm pleased to see that the direction of travel in the white paper is, broadly speaking, being followed, because I think it's the right direction of travel. And that's partly, at least, because, as we've all said, this is a problem that has to now be addressed. We simply can't live in a world where, if we're having more and more time online, doing more and more of our functional existence online, we allow that space to be utterly unregulated, when in every other environment we spend time, whether it's the real world, broadcast media, print media, you name it, regulation exists. So something has to be done. And I think it's true because of its own importance. It's true, as Joe said, because what starts online sometimes moves offline, and therefore we have to be concerned about all of that. The approach that the process that we've initiated with the white paper and continued with the consultation and on, I hope, into legislation, the logic behind it is really this, that there should be a responsibility on online platforms to do the best they can to keep their users safe. Not everything, but what is reasonable to do. And that means that there has to be a duty of care on all of them. I happen to take the view that one of the deficiencies in the current proposals are, as others have said this afternoon, if you try and have a category of large platforms that we act on and a category of small platforms that we worry less about, it doesn't allow, as Joe said, for the use of smaller platforms for some very pernicious things. It doesn't allow either for smaller platforms suddenly gaining much more impact and reach than we expected very quickly, and that can happen. So it's important the system is flexible enough for that. It's important we have an independent regulator. It can't actually be for government to decide what's good and bad online. It must be for an independent regulator to do that. And we've got to, I think, recognize, as I said earlier, that if we allowed a regulator to spend its time deciding whether an individual piece of bad content should be left up or taken down, it would do very little else. So important that we produce something in parallel with that. I'm not pretending this is perfect, far from it. And there are gaps, and we've talked about quite a lot of those gaps. The first of them is around whether there is sufficient breadth in the harms that are covered in the online harms process. Have we got everything right? Almost certainly not. If you limit the harm that you're concerned about to significant harm to an individual, then you miss things out. What about harm to democracy? What about some of the disinformation that is being promulgated, which doesn't necessarily affect individuals at an individual level, but certainly affects us all collectively? What about the fact that we are dealing here quite often with business models that are quite deliberately structured to support pernicious and hateful material? Some of the things that my colleagues here have had to put up with are largely promulgated on platforms that benefit from people continuing to look at content, continuing to engage in argument. And it's certainly clear that when you look at the algorithms that are being used, some of these platforms don't much mind whether this is hateful content or not, as long as people continue to look at it, comment on it, and stay on the site in order to see advertisements. Now, that's something that this bill has to think about too. It's got to think about enforcement. There's a question in the chat about individual director liability, which is being held back in reserve at the moment. I'm not convinced it should be. Neither am I convinced that when you talk about the liability of individual directors, it should just be liability for failing to give information to the regulator. Well, what happens if they give all the information to the regulator, but they're behaving very badly nonetheless? Surely something should be done about that. And in the other lists of things that are missing, Siobhan has talked about anonymity. This is hugely difficult for the reasons that Shay and others have given, but I don't think we can dodge it. I think there has to be, as Shay said, a way of making sure that anonymity is never absolute. Anonymity in other areas of your life is never absolute. If you are arrested, you are required to tell the police who you are, and they're entitled to try and find out if you don't. That shouldn't be different online. So there are limits to anonymity in every other area of our lives. There should be limits to it online, albeit anonymity, for the reasons she gave, is helpful and important in many contexts. There's nothing in this yet about age verification. There needs to be. We need to talk about how we make sure that when it comes to some services, those people who are underage are not able to access them. And I think we also have to focus on media literacy in its broadest sense, as Shay said. There has to be a focus on education, because in the end, however good we are at legislating, however good we are at regulating, in the end, we won't catch every piece of bad content reaching every vulnerable user. So we have to make all of us better digital citizens in every sense, more resolute, more robust, more resilient to everything that is being thrown at us online, because it will continue to be, even if we regulate successfully. And then finally, I suppose I should just say that I think it's hugely important, as others have said, that we work together on this. There's already huge cross-party interest in this, huge willingness, I think, to make this work. And already you're seeing a large number of groups working together. I chaired a meeting last week of 8 all-party groups, of which this all-party group was one. And I think there is a broad measure of agreement in how we can improve this legislation. And that's what now needs to happen, because this is an absolutely golden opportunity, not just to improve the online world with all its positive features that have been mentioned, but also to give some genuine global leadership here. This country is still ahead of the rest in terms of developing these kinds of proposals for regulation. And therefore, let's get it right. And let's make sure that we all participate in the process of improving this legislation when it comes. It started off, I think, on the right lines, though I would say that, wouldn't I? But I do think it's capable of significant improvement in many of the ways and others that we've already discussed. So I hope that's helpful. And thank you, everybody, for participating in this process. Let me thank in particular all the speakers who've done such a great job of encapsulating their views in what's been a limited amount of time. But I think this is the start, as Debbie says, of a process, not the end of it. We've got a lot of work to do to make sure that this bill fulfills its very great potential. And I think on that basis, Matt, unless there's anything you want to say on behalf of the APPG.
No, that's it. Brilliant. Brilliant closing.
We can wish everybody a good afternoon and look forward to continuing this conversation elsewhere. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Take care.